We're going to talk about the concept of what the business cycle is in this lecture. Now, as we know, the economic activity in a particular country moves in a cyclical cycle, and this is mapped by the business cycle. The business cycle maps time against the level of GDP, and it shows how the economy fluctuates over time. And as we know, the business cycle exhibits a wave-like quality. And what this means is that we can see that the economy doesn't exist in a constant rate of growth. It exists in a very unpatterned and unstable path of economic activity, both in the short and the long runs. And so what this means is we're going to examine each of the different parts of the business cycle. So here what we have a peak. This part here, when there is a slowing in economic growth, we call it a contraction. This part here, when the economic growth has bottomed out, this is also called a trough. And now when the economic growth starts growing again, this part here is called an expansion. And this peak here could perhaps also be called a boom. Now these terms may not mean anything to you right now, but we'll go through this as the lecture goes on. And again, when the economy contracts, we have a contraction. And again, we have a trough right here. Trough. And so you can see the economy moves in a wave-like pattern, which forms a sort of steady rate of economic growth mapped by this white line here. So this is the average rate of economic growth. So why is economic growth so important, and why is the business cycle, or understanding the business cycle, so important to economists? So remember, economists seek to maximize our living standards. And living standards can be broken down into material and non-material. Economists can't really control the non-material aspect of living standards because this is so subjective and it is different to everyone. So this is uncontrollable to a large extent by economists because they can't satisfy everyone's non-material living standards. So what they do concentrate on is how they could satisfy the material living standards, and this relates to the consumption of goods and services. And although we can't measure everyone's consumption of goods and services, they can measure the consumption of goods and services of the entire economy. And this relates to the idea of GDP. So how much we produce, we're going to consume. And so it is better if we have a consistently increasing high rate of GDP. Okay, let's break down these terms, these pieces of jargon: peaks, booms, expansions, and troughs. Okay, so what is a peak? A peak, or sometimes a boom, is a period of expansion in the level of economic activities which reaches its upward turning point. So the upward point of an expansion. So what this means is that at this point, unemployment is at the lowest rate, and so this means cyclical unemployment is basically zero. And also at this point, because everyone has high incomes, inflation is also high. And so what this means is that because we have a long-term trend of economic growth, this is where production, or actual GDP, is greater than potential GDP. So we're overproducing, and this means that there is high inflation and unemployment, potentially even structural or natural unemployment has decreased because we're overutilizing our employment or our labor resources. So what this means is that for the GDP to return to its potential level, so that we're not overproducing, and so that inflation is kept under control, the government will use specific policies to decrease the level of growth. And we'll come back to these use of policies in monetary and budgetary policy in later units. So here we have a contraction or a slowdown phase. So what a contraction is, so let's look at contraction. What a contraction is basically the activity that normally follows a peak. And this is synonymous with easing inflation. So say, for example, the RBA decides to increase interest rates, and therefore consumption and investment spending will decrease, and therefore ease demand for inflation. So inflation will decrease, and also unemployment will rise. And this may be a good thing because we're not overproducing here, and we're not overutilizing our unemployment or our labor resources, so that we decrease our non-material living standards. So why is this the case? Is because sometimes when we want to overutilize our unemployment resources, we have to make them go overtime. And as we know, that leisure time forms a component of most people's non-material living standards. So leisure time. So when we will have to work overtime to sort of satisfy the demand for goods and services in the economy, our leisure time is going to decrease, and therefore our non-material living standards would also decrease. So that's bad. So that's why when unemployment rises, this may be a good thing to certain households. So this is what a contraction is when there is an easing in inflation and where unemployment rises. And this all occurs after a time lag. And this is possibly due to the inertial rate of inflation. I will talk about this concept of the inertial rate of inflation in the lecture on the inertial rate of inflation. But what this means is that in the short run, let's just spell this out. Short run, inflation is constant. Okay, so after we pass this contraction phase, we're going to move into what we're going to call a trough. And a trough, sometimes in extreme cases, is a recession, so 2 consecutive periods or 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. So trough represents the lowest point on the business cycle of economic activity. And what this is that there is very, very low national output, and this is indicated by a drop in overall level of GDP. And as you can see, there is a drop in GDP here. So this is represented by a drop in GDP, very low output comparative to recent years, and also high unemployment, and also low inflation. Okay, let's just make this a bit clearer. We don't need this bit here, and we've talked about the peak here. So we'll keep this clear for what an expansion actually is. Okay, let's look at the concept of an expansion now. An expansion is when the economy exits out of its trough or recession. And so the government, when they become aware that output is very low, inflation is very low, and unemployment is very high, they're going to be more concerned about the material living standards of the people. And so they're going to use macroeconomic demand policies or supply policies to encourage spending and to encourage firms to employ more people. And so what the expansion phase is that we're going to start at very low levels of GDP, and we're going to after a time lag period, after a time lag, let's just make this a bit clearer, time lag period, there's going to be an increase in inflation and also an increase in employment, I should say. And what this means is that businesses will start to employ more, they're going to start to produce more, and therefore GDP would increase from the trough period here to a new peak or boom. And so this is what the business cycle generally is that there will be peaks, there will be troughs, there will be expansions, and there will be contractions. But overall, the economy is going to exhibit a long-term growth rate of what is called a trend line here. So this is the average rate of economic growth, and that's what the government aims to achieve. So by using macroeconomic demand factors, they want to keep this economics or this business cycle as close as this line as possible. So they want something like this. They don't want a cycle where you have very, very large peaks and very, very low troughs. That's very bad because, you know, living standards will fluctuate very, very extremely in certain cases. So you don't want that. What you do want is a very, very steady rate of economic growth, so that businesses' unemployment rates, inflation doesn't deviate too much from the potential. And that's what the government aims to achieve in the operations of both monetary and budgetary policy. Okay, so now we're going to look at the concept of what the ideal or stable rate of economic growth is. So we're going to look at the ideal level of economic growth. Or this could be classified as GDP growth. Okay. So what is this ideal level of economic growth or economic activity? So this is the best possible situation for an economy to experience. What this is indicated by is that domestic activity is not too fast. So it allows time for the government to adjust to different policies, and it allows people to adjust to different prevailing economic circumstances. And so what this is there is neither an inflationary boom nor activity which is too slow that requires a recession to occur. No inflationary or no, not too slow GDP growth. And this may be a very, very hard situation for the government to achieve, but they're going to achieve this, or they're going to try to achieve this by using monetary and budgetary, what is also known as fiscal policy. So that's what the business cycle is. The business cycle basically refers to the wave-like ups and downs in a nation's level of production or economic growth. And what the government tries to achieve by analyzing the business cycle is to achieve this ideal level of economic growth or activity.